Good morning, church. So, we are in episode 3 of our series on Ruth, and I'm enjoying walking with Ruth and Naomi. They've become good companions of mine this month. I'm going to remind you that I chose the term providence in pain as the lens for looking at this little Old Testament book of Ruth. You know, some of us have thought of Ruth as a kind of little Cinderella story, like one of those human interest stories they throw in for the last minute and a half of the evening news after they've told you all the horrible, terrible stuff, and then there's something about a stray dog being adopted, and you go, oh, there's still good in the world. And people have thought of this as a little happily ever after story for the woman Ruth. But the truth is it's that, sort of, but it's way more than that. And I don't want to do her or her mother-in-law, Naomi, injustice by not helping us to think about it in terms of how they wrestle with the concept of providence in their own painful lives. So, whoops, I've got to go back here. For some reason, my computer just decided to jump out of the presentation. Let's just see if I got it here. Nope. Okay. So, there we go. What does Providence mean? Well, it's a city in Rhode Island, we know that. So literally it comes from the concept of foresight. God has the ability to see the future. He has provision for the future. So I went online to look at a definition of providence this week, and I got onto Bing AI without meaning to. And they gave me a whole bunch of definitions of providence that they said were biblical, and they were all from Calvinist scholars, because the concept of God ruling over the world, his sovereignty, has been embraced more fully on that side of the theological spectrum. The Wesleyans, on the other hand, have a little more sense of human agency, human free will that plays into what goes on in the world. So I use this term, like the common phrase everybody says is, everything happens for a reason, right? So everything God sees, he causes. That's when you lean into it without the balancing effect of the fact that he gave people free will. So I want us to realize that in the book of Ruth, the characters have to wrestle with what Rabbi Harold Kushner said in a book a couple decades ago, when bad things happen to good people. Why? So John Wesley, we are Wesleyan theologically because we are a Free Methodist church, and we believe that this is a truer expression of how we understand the whole counsel of God. He has a sermon number 68 called On Divine Providence, and he talks about 3 levels of the providence of God. First of all, there's God's care and guidance over the entire of his creation and human history. And then it goes down to the most intimate circle, which is for those of us who have come to know him personally and trust in him and give our lives into his hands, that his providential care goes down to the tiniest detail. Remember how Jesus said, even the hairs on your head are numbered? So my brother Paul, it's getting easier on him now to count them. So I am entitled this one, Risky Business. And some of you who have read ahead in this little book, which I told you on the first Sunday takes 13 minutes to read, know that we're getting to this scene at the threshing floor that maybe some people would call risque. And some people would wonder, should it be rated PG or actually R? Is there some softening of what happened there? Is there some euphemism being expressed? So I want us to look exactly at what kind of risk-taking Ruth took. But before we get there, I want us to look at the biggest question in this series, which is, and for today, how do we move from suffering to hope? Because to me, Naomi and Ruth's actions in this episode show that they have moved from hopelessness to hope. And I'm going to prove that in a minute. Now, in our romantically and sexually charged culture, we would want to rush into this question, what actually happened that night But this bigger question is still here. Because not long ago, we watched these two women in a very different scene. Naomi was lamenting. Ruth was listening. In fact, there was a whole circle of Naomi's friends who listened to her lament. And truly, if they were her old friends, how could they not have joined her in her grief, in her lament? When she came back from Moab, and they said, whoa, that doesn't even look like Naomi. And she said, call me Mara, bitter. Call me bitter. And she had her accusations against God. When she told them that after the famine, they had moved to Moab, their sons had married Moabite women, they had both died without bearing sons, her own husband had died, there was nothing good that happened, really, and she was mourning, lamenting. But I want us to center on this scene again because it centers on a very biblical practice called lament. Jeremiah wrote a whole book called Lamentations. In it, we read one of the most famous statements of lament. Let's read this. Lamentations 3:19-24. The thought of my affliction and my homelessness is wormwood and gall. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. So here's what I want us to note. This I call to mind, and this gives me hope. It's the steadfast love of the Lord. That word chesed, it's got such a wide semantic meaning that we hear lots and lots of English words. Steadfast love, loyalty, loving kindness. At its essence is the concept that God will not let go of us. He holds on. And I think Naomi's deepest place was crying out, did everything I thought I believed about this God who never lets go turn out to be wrong? Is his chesed no longer true? Did he let go of me? Did he abandon me? Listen to the prophet Isaiah, chapter 49, verses 14-16. I don't have it on the screen, but just listen. But Zion said, the Lord has forsaken me. The Lord has forgotten me. Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has born? Though she may forget, I will not forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. Your walls are ever before me. He's talking about the walls of Jerusalem. The source of hope is the steadfast love of God. It's to believe that God, whom we have come to know in the past and who loves us in the present, will still be there in the future and will not let us go. Jesus said, I will never leave you or forsake you. Can we believe that? Without that, we don't have hope. Now, I just want us to move the lens a little bit and think about the horrific war in the Middle East right now, these last 2 weeks. We have to wonder how God's people there are struggling to believe in God's chesed. His people who worship him in the Jewish faith, in the Christian faith. Even Muslims who are crying out to God, looking for some kind of shalom, some kind of peace in the West Bank, in Gaza, in the whole region. These people are crying out, and I think they're crying out a lot in the same way that Naomi did. I don't know if you get our Light and Life magazine. It comes into your inbox if you sign up for it. 2 articles every Tuesday morning. It used to come out as a full print magazine, and I suspect that my parents were the only ones who read it cover to cover the day it came. But now it comes 2 articles a week, and you can just stop for 10 or 15 minutes. And this week it was wonderful. Fraser Venter, who was recently here in chapel, he's our strategic catalyst for love-driven justice in the Free Methodist Church. And he wrote this, I woke up today, and this is how I prayed. He quotes Dr. Mary Glenn from Fuller Theological Seminary, who says, "Lament is a practice of naming and navigating personal and communal pain, longing, and loss, especially in relationship to vocation, calling, and God's shalom work. Lord, where is peace? Where is shalom?" Fraser says, lament includes a loud cry, a howl, or a passionate expression of grief. But biblically, it's more than sorrow or talking about sadness. It's more than walking through the stages of grief. Lament is a prayer in pain that leads to trust. Lament is our path through brokenness, war, death, fear, confusion, hopelessness, and disappointment. Mark Vinogop in Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy says, lament is the path from heartbreak to hope. Therefore, lament is rooted in what we believe. It is a prayer loaded with theology. Christians affirm that the world is broken, God is powerful, and he will be faithful. Therefore, human lament stands in the gap between pain and promise. To cry is human, but to lament is Christian. Naomi was lamenting, and we need to lament. Listen to Naomi's complaints against God. She says, he's made my life very bitter. And by the way, when she wants to change her name to Mara, which means bitter, she's at a very dangerous moment because she's thinking she wants to choose her whole identity for her future to be in this point of pain. She wants to change her name. That's pretty dangerous. I went away full, but he has brought me back empty. He has afflicted me. He has brought misfortune upon me. This is how she's thinking about God in this moment. Now, here's something interesting. The very fact that she charges God with these injustices reveals that she still believes God is supposed to be just. But she has to find some meaning in her life that includes how this God could still be good. She believes that Providence should have been protecting her from pain. So her formula for understanding God and her own life has to be adjusted. Episode 3 shows evidence that Naomi and Ruth have moved from despair to hope. How did they get there? How can we? Here's one thing. Naomi's complaint was expressed in a kind of confessional community. Lamenting together tells the truth and binds the mourners together. I've been thinking this week about Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times, and his friends, the other disciples, knew it. It was his most shameful moment, and it was very public. And instead of, in his shame, isolating, like Judas did and ended up killing himself, or running off and finding a new group of friends who didn't know all that messy stuff about me in my moment, in my darkest moment, in my moment of greatest weakness and sin, he stuck with that very group of people who knew him inside out. It's profound that you have a few people who know you so well, who are a safe place, that when you pour out your struggle, your confusion, your doubt, your pain, your darkest history, they can look at you, they can gaze into your eyes with love and hold your look, and you can look back. There's a healing that happens. So lamenting together is part of what the church needs to learn how to do. That's part of why we have community groups, rooted groups. It's part of why in the college we have, in the university, we have small groups of people who can learn to trust each other. I think of it as have a trampoline that's so strong that you can bounce on it as hard as you have to bounce and it won't break. They're going to be standing around the edge spotting you. You're okay. Naming our pain in the presence of compassionate listeners can begin our journey to wholeness. So I believe that's the start. Now, finally, we're going to get to the text. Some of you were waiting for this. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for." Now, wait a minute here. Do you think there's a little bit of evidence that she's turned a corner? She's thinking about the future. She's starting to make a plan. Now, Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. No more widow wear. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he's lying in the dark. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. Okay, there's some weird background laws that we have to understand, or this makes no sense at all. There's two sets of the Mosaic law that I'm just going to refer to briefly so we can understand kind of what's going on here. The Levirate law is Deuteronomy 25, 5-9, and it says this: "If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family." That already feels weird to us, doesn't it? "Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she, not he, she, shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, 'My husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me.' Then the elders of his town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, 'I do not want to marry her,' his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, 'This is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line.'" Do you ever read the Old Testament and scratch your head? Like we should, because we're crossing centuries, millennia of culture, and we're trying to understand, why would this happen? Why would God, through the Mosaic law, have this sort of rule? Well, it mattered supremely that the family line be carried on and that the property be passed from one generation, one son, to another. And this was a merciful provision. We have to stop and ask, but wouldn't that very often mean that the brother-in-law is going to have two wives? Like, that's not God's ideal. It isn't. And yet, it seems to be in this situation that God thinks a family being retained and carrying on is better, even under that circumstance, than a widow dying of starvation and being left out in the cold alone. That's one of the laws that's in Naomi and Ruth's mind. The second one is the kinsman redeemer law, and it says this. Leviticus 25:25 says, "If any of your Israelite relatives go bankrupt and are forced to sell some inherited land, then a close relative, a kinsman redeemer, may buy it back for them." So the idea of redemption, buying back. The kinsman redeemer, on behalf of the dead brother or cousin, buys the land back so that it can carry on. We just have to have that in the back of our minds to understand this story at all. So I want to ask this question about what we've read so far. What do the actions of the women reveal about how they understand God's sovereignty and the working of providence in the world? That's a theological question. So here's one thing I noticed. They don't just sit home and have a prayer meeting day after day, week after week, forever and ever. They didn't expect God to unilaterally bail them out of their predicament with no involvement and not using this that comes between their ears. They believe in their own agency and freedom to act within these laws that God has provided. And although the definition of a widow that we learned last week means a voiceless one, they now speak up in bold, risk-taking ways. They plan and they act. Let's not lose sight of what's happening here, okay? Now we're going to get to the part that all the rabbis for generations wanted to speculate about, because boy, oh boy, does it break the Billy Graham rule. Some of you don't even know the Billy Graham rule. Wow. So Ruth 3, verses 7 to 18. After Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he lay down at the far end of the pile of grain and went to sleep. Then Ruth came quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. Around midnight, Boaz suddenly woke up. His feet are cold. And turned over. He was surprised to find a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant, Ruth," she replied. "Spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer." Stop. She knew and he knew what you might not know. She just proposed marriage to him. So that word for the corner of your robe that's going to cover her is the same word as last week when he said, "The Lord Almighty will cover you." She will come under the covering of the Lord's wing. The wing of the Lord and the corner of his garment are the covering. And symbolically, when she says, "Put your corner of your garment over me," she's proposing marriage. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," Boaz exclaimed. Is that how you expect him to respond to this brazen request in the middle of the night in the dark? "The Lord bless you, my daughter. You are showing even more family loyalty now than you did before, for you have not gone after a younger man, whether rich or poor. Now don't worry about a thing, my daughter. I will do what is necessary, for everyone in town knows you are a virtuous woman." Remember last week, Hayil? She is a woman of noble character, like Proverbs 31. Like he's a man of noble character. Everybody in town knows that about you, he says. "But while it's true that I am one of your family redeemers, there's another man who's more closely related to you than I am. Stay here tonight, and in the morning I will talk to him. If he is willing to redeem you, very well, let him marry you. But if he's not willing, then as surely as the Lord lives," how sure is that? "I will redeem you myself." So Ruth lay at Boaz's feet until the morning, but she got up before it was light enough for people to recognize each other, for Boaz had said, "No one must know that a woman was here on the threshing floor." Then Boaz said to her, "Bring your cloak and spread it out." He measured 6 scoops of barley into the cloak and placed it on her back. Then he returned to the town. When Ruth went back to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "What happened, my daughter?" Ruth told Naomi everything Boaz had done for her. And she added, "He gave me these 6 scoops of barley and said, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said to her, "Just be patient, my daughter, until what we hear has happened. The man won't rest until he has settled things today." That's what the text tells us. Now, rabbis from earliest times, the Mishnah and everybody, online right now, is saying, well, it's possible that she didn't just uncover his feet and she didn't just stay at the foot of the bed. There is a lot of suspicion because our romantically and sexually charged culture, and there's some tension in this scene here, even way back when, that the rabbis were trying to sort out, could they really have behaved this way? And I want to say to you that the text has been sure to tell us that these are people of noble character, that the man and the woman both are people of integrity, they are upright before the Lord, and they would have been able to conduct themselves the way the text says they did. I believe that's what happened. But I also want us to look at how all three of these people act in hesed for the sake of the others. Think about this. Naomi, first of all, she wants to find a home for Ruth. She knows that if she dies and Ruth is a foreign widow with no husband and no prospects, she's going to be really vulnerable and destitute. And so Naomi is thinking of a plan that will take care of Ruth. She also wants this good man, I think, to have the company of this good woman. He's already shown himself to be generous and compassionate, to take good care of his workers and the gleaners around the edges. But I think especially she wants her dead husband and son to have an heir. She's being kind to them. And this will accomplish that. What about Ruth? She wants to make sure Naomi has a roof over her head in her old age. And she will give Boaz the opportunity to prove his nature as Chayil, that he will be the kinsman redeemer, that he will act honorably in memory of his dead relative. And then she will serve him as a good wife. Maybe not his only wife. That does make it complicated. Some have speculated, well, how could this man not be married already? If he's probably middle-aged, it just wouldn't have happened. Perhaps he is married. Perhaps he's a widower. We don't know that. But we know that Ruth has proposed that he would take care of her in the way that a kinsman redeemer would. And then Boaz. Is he going to take advantage of Ruth? Is she in danger when she sneaks up and lies at the end of his bed when he's had a little bit to drink? He will fulfill the obligation of the kinsman redeemer for the sake of his dead relatives. But he will also bring two widows into the circle of his care and provision. Do you notice how often he sends like a gigantic doggy bag home to Naomi? Like he's providing for these hungry women. And he also has provision, providence. He will be part of God's providential care for these at the margins of society. So the story will be continued next week. I hope you'll be here in person or online, and we'll be able to finally wrap up the story. But I want to spend the last few minutes with some application for us. This book, I'm not kidding, it's the best book I've read in 5 years, 10 years, as long as I can remember. Kurt Thompson is a medical doctor, is a neurobiologist, and a psychiatrist, and a deeply committed Christian theologian. I've heard him speak twice, and he was at the National Association of Evangelicals a couple of weeks ago, and I had heard him a year ago, and he was the best speaker, so I got on my computer and just about court recorded him, because I just had to get everything he said, and then I bought his book right there on Amazon on my phone while he was talking. Did I like it? The subtitle is, so it's called The Deepest Place, Suffering and the Formation of Hope. So now I'm just going to give you a little snippet of that, because here's what I want us to realize. This sermon and the book of Ruth are for all of us who have suffered, who are suffering, or who will suffer. Does that leave you out? I think the truth is it's for all of us. So, he says that pain plus time equals suffering. So there's a lot of things we can endure for an instant. Like even if we touch our finger on the top of the stove, for an instant, it hurts, and then it might hurt a little later, but we could endure it for an instant. Then there's some kinds of pain that we can endure for longer. Grief over the loss of a loved one, regret over some horrible accident, or some diagnosis from a doctor. I mean, there are things that make us suffer. But what this neurobiologist says is that it gets worse because our minds are anticipation machines. So we always project our suffering into the future. And sometimes we think it will never end. And because it seems like it's going to go on and on and on with no end in sight, the initial pain is magnified. Let's go to the next slide. It says he gives us 3 sources of suffering, which I will just touch on. But if you want to know more, get the book. First of all, things that have happened to us at the hand of others, intent, or circumstance. Now, part of what our minds are is meaning makers. We have to figure out sometimes someone is to blame. And sometimes it's not God. Okay, here we go. This is where we get into the messy part about trying to understand how God works in this world. Let me just give you a few examples, and you'll supply your own. Between services, somebody told me that already they were supplying their own examples. Abusive parents, kids who bullied you at school, a drunk driver whose truck hit your daughter. Like, there's some blame to be assigned, and that's really not on God, is it? Is it? So part of what we have to do is acknowledge sometimes and tell someone else who can hear it from us. We have to name it. We have to blame somebody for what they actually did to us, and pretending that they didn't doesn't help us heal. The second kind of suffering is what we've done to ourselves. A lot of us are beating ourselves up all the time for mistakes we made a long time ago. And sometimes our suffering that we do to ourselves is because we tell ourselves the story that somebody else told us in the first place. Somebody who told us we were ugly and unlovable, we begin to tell ourselves, I'm ugly and unlovable. And that becomes who I think I really truly am. And you can have 100 more examples of how we extend our own suffering by isolating ourselves and telling ourselves lies, or listening to the lies of the enemy that would divide and destroy us. And we have sinned. Isn't forgiveness a wonderful gift? Isn't it a wonderful thing to be able to come and confess our sin to God and have him wipe the slate clean? Say, you are forgiven. And I love it when in a communion ritual, the person up front, as a person who serves communion, I say, you are forgiven. And the whole congregation says, you are forgiven. It's a beautiful thing to be forgiven for our sins and to be able then to move beyond and let ourselves off the hook for our regrets. And then the third kind of suffering is really interesting. In the process of growth, there's a new kind of suffering. In the effort to follow Jesus as hard as we can, we might take on extra suffering. We might be judged by our friends. I think about last February, I spoke in chapel here, and afterwards the altar was lined, and then students stayed around, and some stayed all the way until 10 o'clock at night. And there were groups of students clumping around each other and praying, and there were students who confessed, you know, I've been stuck in pornography or eating disorders or harming myself, cutting myself. I am abusing drugs or alcohol. I'm doing whatever it takes to try to soothe my pain. And they declared in that moment, I'm turning my back on that now. I'm going to be liberated. Jesus set me free from that. And we laid hands on them and we prayed for that liberty last February. And as I was preparing this message this week, I thought, I wonder how each and every one of those young people who was so determined in that moment to turn their back on the things that were destroying them and to walk into freedom and life, how are they doing? How are you doing? Because the life is still there, but there's some suffering along the way when we say no to habits that have bound us for years. When we decide to forgive someone who has harmed us in ways that are beyond words. To live into the cross. Oh yes, Jesus said, follow me. And Paul said, I die every day. Is there some pain and suffering in following Jesus for real? Yes, there is. Of course there is. The New Testament talks about that a lot. Kurt Thompson says this, processing that pain and its attendant suffering foisted upon us puts us in a tricky state of mind. On the one hand, we can so greatly focus our attention on our perceived source of distress, directing our rage, resentment, disappointment and contempt upon it that we do little to turn our attention in the direction of our healing. This focus then repeatedly recommits us interpersonally and neurobiologically to the very state of suffering that we're enduring, reinforcing that which we long to escape. So our responses often contribute to further suffering, condemning ourselves, shaming ourselves for things over which we had no control, or we did, extends our suffering. So we create a narrative in our mind that becomes a running commentary accompanying our trauma and stress. In isolation, our story reinforces hopelessness. But then, as I said, the third kind of suffering, the third source, some suffering comes as a direct result of the pursuit of healing. To walk into the light, to move toward wholeness, is a painful journey that requires great effort. Swimming against the current of our old patterns and the story we have told ourselves involves suffering. This is sharing in Christ's suffering. This is redemptive suffering. And with this kind of suffering, perseverance provides the bridge between suffering and hope. We just have to turn to the New Testament because as good as the Old Testament is, it's only pointing us in the direction of the fullest expression of this Redeemer. Next week, we're going to look at how the kinsman Redeemer is a faint picture of the universal Redeemer we have in Jesus, who went to the cross for us and who lives forevermore to reign and to intercede on our behalf. What a wonderful truth. But I want us to look now just at the first paragraph of Romans 5 in conclusion, because this is the whole story for those of us who live on this side of the cross and the resurrection, the ascension, and the coming of the Holy Spirit. Paul writes to the Romans, "Therefore, since we've been justified through faith," hallelujah, "we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ." Where is the shalom? It's right there. "Through whom we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand. And we boast in the hope of the glory of God. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So see the progression there. It's so beautiful and powerful. It's a whole sermon into itself, but I really just had to end here. First, there's faith. Then there's peace with God. And then there's the grace by which we stand. And then, yes, there is suffering, but as we persevere in that suffering, character comes, maturity, integrity, and then hope. And there's no shame, because it all ends with the love of God, the hesed of God. It's still true. He has not let us go, and he will not. Some of you have noticed that I didn't sing a little quip from a show tune. I'm going to give you one of my favorite choruses to close. I know a place, a wonderful place, where accused and condemned find mercy and grace, where the wrongs we have done and the wrongs done to us are nailed there with him, there on the cross. He did it for all of us, for our own sin and for those who have sinned against us. There is freedom, there is life, there is hope.